Mhm.
Welcome everyone to our event, Colonisation and Resistance, Palestine, Israel and the Struggle for Liberation. I'd like to start the day by acknowledging the Indigenous peoples in which we meet today. Many of us are joined here today from various places around Australia, whether it's Naarm or Gadigal land. I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the Indigenous people of this land, to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and recognise the deep-seated connection that we as Palestinians in resistance also share with Indigenous people in this country. We cannot divorce the experiences of settler colonialism that our Indigenous brothers and sisters experienced here in Australia, in Naarm, where I'm speaking from you today, but also Palestinian resistance against settler colonialism. Both our struggles have faced ethnic cleansing and genocide. And it's why we speak meaningfully in solidarity with our Indigenous brothers and sisters here in Australia, and welcome those who join us in Indigenous land. And we assert very firmly this always is, always will be Aboriginal land. So thank you everyone who has joined us. This event has been organised by Palestine Justice Movement Sydney and Free Palestine Melbourne, and there's a very important reason why we have organised this session. We're here to talk about Palestinian resistance and the right for liberation. Throughout the last century, regardless of the dominant movement's leader or ideology, Palestinian resistance has been designated as terrorism. And this follows an established Western colonial pattern in throwing terror designations on all national liberation movements and leaders, whether we saw that in Algeria against its anti-colonial resistance against the French from the 1830s, to the way Nelson Mandela and Yasser Arafat were designated as terrorists in the 1980s. In every case, the designation terrorist attempts to close down discussion of any explanation, erasing the political character of anti-colonial resistance and historical context of resistance movements and their tactics. The Western treatment of Palestinian resistance, and we've seen this very clearly here in Australia and around the world since October of 2023, continues this really long tradition of refusing any context and insisting on a snapshot narrative wherein nothing that happened prior to October 7th or indeed after can be allowed to enter the conversation. And questions about why Hamas undertook these attacks and what were the root causes and how has the long brutality of the Israeli occupation and apartheid regime fueled this was simply ignored. Any slight deflection from that particular hegemonizing snapshot of discourse or any attempt to include context has been attacked immediately and extremely ferociously. And this is actually a slight excerpt from one of our speakers today, who's an expert on Palestinian resistance and the rise of resistance, who joins us today. And I'd like to welcome him. Khaled Hroub is a Palestinian professor. He is in residence of the Faculty of Liberal Arts at Northwestern University in Qatar. He's authored several books, including Hamas, A Beginner's Guide, Hamas, Political Thought and Practice, and edited Political Islam, Context versus Ideology, and Religious Broadcasting in the Middle East. He is also a poet, a novelist, whose work includes Ink of the Sun and I Slap the Face of the Sky, and go on. We're extremely honoured to have him join us today to have this important conversation. The purpose of us today is to tackle these questions and address them. I'd like to also take a moment to advise that we do have a very last minute apology. Unfortunately, Sarah Saleh, one of our speakers today and conveners, award-winning human rights lawyer and also Palestinian Lebanese Egyptian migrant, is unable to join us. Unfortunately, she's had some flight delays, which has meant she's been unable to join us today. And as well as, unfortunately, Miko Palad, who was quite keen to join us and due to the time difference living overseas, has had to pull out last minute as well. So unfortunately, we don't have them both joining us today, but we do have with us one of the organisers of today's events and also one of the co-founders of Palestine Justice Movement Sydney. His name is Ahmed Abadli. He is a Palestinian man born in Khan Yunis in Gaza. He is an activist and campaigner through the BDS movement. He's also is an engineer, has a master's in physics. You may find a lot of us Palestinians have master's degrees floating around. And he was last in Palestine in Ghazi in September of 2023. This event also is hosted by other Palestinian organisations across the country. I will be going at the end of the session in detail around the organisations involved. But I think it's really important to start the conversation with our two wonderful panelists with us. So thank you very much, Dr. Khaled Hroub, for joining us. We're very honoured to have you with us, and Ahmed Abadli. Thank you.
Ahmed, you want to start or?
Yes, I would like to start. I'm just waiting on the technical expert to put me up. Oh, there we go. Thanks, Fernanda. Hi, Professor Khaled, and hi, everyone. My name is Ahmed. I am, as May said, I'm Palestinian from Gaza, and I'm going to be mediating the conversation with Professor Khaled Hroub today. I also, before I start, want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land we're meeting on today. I am dialing in from Camaragal in Gadigal land, and I want to acknowledge that the sovereignty of this land was never ceded. This was and still is the ground zero of a genocide that continues to this day against the indigenous peoples of this land. Professor Khaled Hroub, very delighted to be with you.
Thank you very much, Ahmed, and thanks, May, for the invitation and organization of this event.
It's our pleasure. It's an honor to have you on board today. Professor, so Palestinians in the West and inside the occupied Palestinian territories and inside Israel as well, have been facing tough questions about the ongoing genocide in Gaza at the moment. And it has been exhausting, to say the least. In particular, in trying to work out how to frame, even to understand, and at times, have an attempt to justify October the 7th events. Like many Palestinian figures said, it seems that the world has short memory when it comes to the Palestinian question or the Palestinian struggle. And there are forces existing that try to sustain that short memory in terms of the media, in terms of the political structure, and so on and so forth. And we find ourselves having to re-explain what the Palestinian resistance movement is over and over and over again, within the context of our history, our displacement, oppression, and, attempts to erase us. Because to me, I think everything about the Palestinian identity is centered around the concept of resistance. We Palestinians were born into this framework. We didn't have the leverage of choice in that regard. And so I really want to kick us off by, asking you this question. What do we mean when we say Palestinian resistance? And, can you give us a brief historical context about the Palestinian resistance? I mean, how has, bless you, how has the nature of the Palestinian resistance evolved from the early 20th century to the present day? If you can help us unpack this question.
Okay, Ahmed, thanks. And I guess maybe this is a very good start to put things into perspective. And thanks to May as well for alluding to the key notion of the context. Because I think the struggle nowadays and the debate, all the fighting is about delinking Palestine and what's happening nowadays and at this very moment from what happened in the past and from what happened even after October the 7th. There is a tendency, as you see everywhere in the media and politics, and even in, unfortunate, in some academic even approaches, to fixate our sight on October the 7th as maybe everlasting event. It doesn't have any roots. It doesn't have maybe any consequences in terms of genocide and the brutality on the Palestinians. We need to talk only about October the 7th, as if it has, again, it's an isolated event. So the talk about the context and freeing the debate and even fighting this debate is, I think, very crucial for me. So the Palestinian resistance, in fact, goes back almost a century ago. It started under against the British, the original colonizer of Palestine. It started in 1917 during the First World War. The British colonized Palestine, as they did with other parts of the region in the Middle East. And then during that period that lasted for almost more than 20 years, 30 years in fact, they facilitated the emergence of the Zionist project in Palestine. The Zionist project in Palestine originated in Europe as a European colonial side project. Then it transplanted in Palestine again as a sister project for the British colonization of the land and the area. So we had 30 years of dual colonial project in Palestine between 17 until 1948. And in this period, in fact, the British managed to restructure the nature of Palestine. Palestine, part of the Arab land, part of the wider, let's say, Middle East, Arab, Muslim, and even cosmopolitan area. And now they wanted, according to the so-called Balfour Declaration, to change the nature of the whole land into a Jewish state. So that was, in fact, in a way, a British project. So the Palestinians, in fact, started their journey of resistance not against the Zionist project, the emerging Zionist project, but also against the greatest power of the time, that was Great Britain. And since then, until this very moment, more than a century, the Palestinians have been in this process of fighting back, trying to maybe reverse, if you like, what the great powers have been doing against them. After the demise of the British, the Americans took over in supporting the Zionist project in Palestine. So the Palestinians had the fate of fighting not your, if you like, ordinary enemy. Throughout the different stages, they have been fighting and resisting against the superpower of the time. Back in the past against the British, and nowadays against the American even empire. Now, in between, we have the Palestinians had various approaches, various even ideologies, fighting now the established and the created state of Israel on their own land. A case of settler colonialism, as we have seen it in Australia, and where you speak, in Canada, in America, and elsewhere, with settler colonialism, as you know, different from colonialism. There are prerequisites, and one of them is the ethnic cleansing of the indigenous people, exterminating them if that was needed, expelling them from the land, and then claiming ownership of the land. So it is not this classical colonial project where you go to another land and then plunder their wealth, occupy them for a certain period of time, then you go back to the metropole, to the mother colonial country, be it France, Belgium, Britain, Italy, or whatever. So you have a reference point in the classical colonial project, where again the people, the colonizers, they go back. With settler colonialism, you have this extermination nature in it, that I come to your land, then I claim ownership, and then you have to go away, you have to go out of sight, either by killing you or by expelling you, or so and so. So the project, the Zionist project in Palestine, is a settler colonial one in the sense. So the fate of the Palestinians was meant to be the same fate of the indigenous people of in Australia and in America and North America and elsewhere. The Palestinians had to fight what was the main blueprint that was designed for them, in fact. And then in doing so, in fighting this project, they adopted, and I wrote about this in several places, they adopted whatever ideology that was offered, maybe, if you like, in the market. They adopted Marxism, they adopted pan-Arab nationalism, they adopted nationalism, and then later on they adopted Islamism. So all these ideologies were deployed and employed to achieve one single objective, that is the liberation of Palestine. So they started with pan-Arab nationalism, meaning that is the liberation of Palestine is somehow connected to a wider Arab cause. If the Arabs get united, then they will be able to liberate Palestine. Then the Marxist and leftist ideology connecting the Palestinian resistance to global and universal emancipatory, if you like, a project against colonialism, capitalism, and imperialism. And then you had more or less limited national project led by Fatah, the famous Palestinian faction, saying we don't need to link the Palestinian resistance to a grand scheme of things. We need to focus on the liberation of Palestine, and the main way is armed struggle. So that is the Palestinian national project. All of them more or less succeeded in part, maybe failed here and there. And then with Hamas in 1987, we have the Islamist ideology now deployed in the struggle, focusing on Palestine. Originally, it was again connected to wider and the grand project, the Islamization of the region, but over time it became narrowed down to the Palestinian affairs, saying again, seeking the Palestinian liberation. What I wanted to say is, you have this project, and now the very last and the present episode of it is Hamas, is part of a long journey of Palestinian resistance that goes back at least a century ago. And now what we are within this, I have to say, what was happening to the Palestinian people? The Palestinian people somehow got themselves centered around the notion of resistance. They thought any group, any movement, any ideology that would practice resistance against the occupier, against the colonizer, should take the lead, should enjoy political legitimacy. So within the Palestinian national psyche, if you like, you have the notion of resistance was ingrained really deeply until this very moment. So movements and the groups, they would go up and down according to their adherence to the notion of resistance. The support to Hamas nowadays is not for maybe the Islamist or religious ideology of Hamas. You have, of course, a segment of the Palestinians who support Hamas for that. But the wider support of Hamas comes from this notion, the notion of resistance. As long as we have occupation in Palestine, as long as the colonization project in Palestine exists, you have resistance. It may take different ideological form, different political leaning, but the core of it is resistance. The leader of this resistance could be, again, pan-Arab nationalist, Palestinian nationalist, Marxist, or an Islamist. It doesn't matter that much. What matters is again the core of the project, that is resistance.
Yes, and you've mentioned a lot, so we want to dig deeper and unpack a lot of these comments that you just made. And indeed, I mean, it's very important to put the current resistance, the struggle, within the context of the settler colonial system and their strategies and the ways they go about the indigenous population. I mean, one of the strategies is to trivialize the indigenous population. In Palestine case, they had this slogan, a land without people for people without land. And here on this continent, for example, you know, the land was declared terra nullius, you know. So it's the exact same origin of the settler colonial project. And, you know, we do have a long history of resistance, you know, in the world, across the world, from Palestine to the civil rights movement, to the indigenous movements here on this continent, you know, alongside other colonized peoples. So thinkers like Fanon and revolutionary figures like Kwame Ture, Angela Davis, you know, Gary Foley and Mandela, to mention a few, you know, have helped shift the discourse on popular resistance, really, which has been demonized and stigmatized by the imperialist and colonial powers. So the question is, and before I pose the question to you, Professor Khaled, I just want to encourage everyone in the audience to dig in and just pose their questions in the Q&A window, and hopefully we'll get to them towards the end, and then we'll answer as much as we can. So the question to you, given what I've just said about the nature of resistance worldwide and the rich history of liberation movements, I mean, how far has our understanding come to the concept of popular resistance? And if not far enough, apparently that's the case. Why is that? Like, what are the factors obstructing us from having a good grasp of that conception of popular resistance?
Yes, Ahmed. I think maybe a starting point in answering this question and let's say placing the concept of resistance and popular resistance within a wider perspective is to acknowledge and then to realize what kind of world that we live in. I think the starting point is to say that we live in a neo-colonial world. This is a neo-imperial reality that we are operating within, or maybe rather to say operating against. If we acknowledge this reality, that is colonialism in the very classical fashion maybe had ended, so you don't have so much military occupation and colonization of one country, one state of another country or nation, yet you still have the dominance and the hegemony of a number of Western powers, mostly, over the rest of the world. So you have the nature of colonialism, or the core of colonialism, as identified by control, dominance, and exploitation, is still there. And this is why Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana back in 1960s, even back in 1960s, after the liberation of many African countries from their former colonial masters, he wrote a book saying colonialism and neo-colonialism, because he realized, yes, you know, the colonizers had left Ghana or any African countries, but still the linkages and the levers of control remained even after their departure. So these countries in Africa and Asia and elsewhere, they felt as if they remain subjugated to the colonial dominance, even if they don't have the army, the colonial army, in front of their eyes. This is in fact a reality that continued until this very moment. If you think of the whole world, you have the classical Western colonial mantra, the West and the rest, I think is still valid. So you have the West, you have the Western powers controlling the rest of the world in different means, via economy, finance, media, military, of course, this and that. So you have this lack of global justice, which is my second point. So that is the first point, the neo-colonial, neo-imperial world that we live in. And then the second point is the lack of justice, the lack of global justice. As you said in Australia, and the indigenous people of the real owners of the land, they are now out of sight. And this goes across the board globally. You will have dozens and dozens of injustices that are clear-cut. We can see them, but we can't do anything for them. So this is it. The lack of global injustice prompts all of us to say, well, in this case, the resistance and the fight against global injustices, including Palestine, is something universal, something global. And this is my third point, that is to break away from the locality of any resistance project. Any injustice case, if it was limited and then dealt with as a restricted case, in this case, the chances of winning and fighting against the oppressors, I think, would be lesser. But if we broaden, if we break away, and if we stretch the locality of any resistance cause to make it global at a universal level, and then make the linkages and connections with other causes, in this case, we create the, let's say, the movement for global justice with different, even including, let's say, what? The exploitation of capitalism nowadays. Well, away from Palestine, away even from any political issue. Think of a week ago, I was doing something. Can you imagine? Can everybody imagine that is on an annual basis, we have almost 3 million children die out of poverty? Who is the criminal? Who is behind this? After all this progress, all this global wealth, then we have people, kids, they just die out of poverty. And then the focus is on terrorism. So why not? The focus is not on poverty and in economic justice. This is the fourth point. This is because who creates the global discourse, the dominant discourse, that we need to focus on this issue, terrorism, instead of environment or global poverty, is the same master who creates, who controls the media. So with controlling the whole, the economy, the politics, the military, we control the media, and we invent the dominant discourse. We need to talk about this issue. A number of issues, suddenly they take the lead, and we can see them in the media everywhere, headlines, TV coverage, and everybody talks about this. Consciously or unconsciously, we became imprisoned in certain talks. Why to talk about these along a list of issues at the expense of so many other uncovered issues? Again, this is part of the neo-colonial reality. So I think we need to raise our awareness and connect all these dots into one single struggle. That is the struggle against injustices in the world that we live in. Palestine nowadays, because of the genocide that takes place on a daily basis nowadays, as we speak, symbolizes the lack of injustice globally and universally. And this is why people now everywhere in so many countries, in so many parts of the world, they support Palestine. Yes, for Palestine as a cause, but Palestine as a notion, Palestine as a symbol of the fight against these exploiting global powers, that we feel as if we are paralyzed. We can't change, the structure that is controlled by these superpowers. So I think we need to keep the thrust and keep resisting and fighting on all these fronts, the political front, economic front, poverty front, if you like, media front, and university front. Maybe we will come to the university front at one point in the discussion. Thanks.
Yes, 100%. I couldn't agree more about the new colonial structure. I mean, it's the colonization of the brain, really, that is, driven by this capitalistic system. And what happens is everyone is feeling that what Gaza did, it awakens the world to these kind of injustices, the climate injustice, this exploiting capitalistic system that we live in. They're all connected, they're all feeding into, this weapons manufacturers that are feeding wars and, compounding the problems in Gaza and the genocide that's currently ongoing. And so I wanted to dig deeper a little bit about the concept of the media and the coverage. So I take it you've been very, very busy over the past 9 months with your writings, with your editing books, or probably conducting interviews about the situation in Gaza. I mean, how difficult has it been for you as a Palestinian first, and as an expert on the subject matter of the Palestinian resistance, specifically the armed resistance, to explain these concepts? And why has it been difficult? I mean, someone like yourself, for example, all these authors that written books about Hamas, they should be the first point of contact for the mainstream media to explain, or trying to objectively or analytically talk about the armed resistance in Palestine and draw these connections that you just mentioned historically, and specifically about Hamas, the history and evolution and so on and so forth. So how difficult has it been for you, I mean, trying over and over again explain these things and explain that, we Palestinians have a voice and we are entitled to it?
Yeah. Thanks, Ahmed. In fact, in over the past 9 months, it has been, I would say, maybe a very rough ride. As you said, I wrote a couple of books on Hamas. I consider myself as one of the experts in the matter. My first book was published in 1996, maybe at a time when Hamas was very small and very and less influential group. And since then until now, I have been covering, the different developments of the movement. And yet, when somebody calls you to talk about, October the 7th and what happened, they start to feed you in, to fill you in what to talk. Please, Professor, don't speak about this and that. Let's kind of focus on this. Yes, we know there is a context, but our focus now is on this event. So they are telling you in advance. So the producer would call me in advance, and then we have a chat. Sometimes, to test, my views and my opinions, what I'm going to say. And then if I go off the mark, another phone call, maybe after a few hours, they'll say, we have some modification and changes in the program. So thank you very much, meaning just go away. We are not kind of interested in your views and this and that. I remember very well in the first week after October the 7th, I was interviewed by an American network. And again, we went through maybe 1 hour because the interview was planned to be live. So that was very risky. They can't do any edit on it. So they interviewed me twice, not interviewed me, but we had a chat twice before the interview, 2 days before the interview. We went through everything. And again, with the instructions, the atmosphere is very volatile. So let's not talk about this. If you can mitigate and tone down this or that. Then I went with the flow just because, everybody was so scared to talk about Hamas resistance and the Palestinians. You remember, in the very first week, you have all these stories, Hamas massacred, civilians in Israeli settlements and towns. 1,400 Israelis were killed, 800, I remember the figures very well, 800 of them civilians and 400, police force and soldiers. So we were talking about this figure. Somebody asked me about this figure. Then I said, well, I take this figure with doubt, with suspicion. I am not confirming and not denying anything of what we are reading, but we need a third party to verify these figures, these events. Because why is this? Because we had 3 stories from day one, from maybe the very first hours of the event. One story is dozens of kids, babies, were beheaded and burned. There was mass rape. And then thirdly, 1,400 people were massacred. I said back then, a week after these stories, the first 2 ones, the beheaded babies and the raped women, were proven to be fabricated because there was no proof, no evidence, no concrete evidence. So based on this, I think I have the ground to doubt the third story. We need a third party. I am not denying what was supposedly happened, but we need a third party to verify this. This is what we teach our students, at the universities. If you have a story, if you are a historian, if you are a media person, if you are whatever, you need to have the 2 sides of the story, the 3 sides of the story to verify any evidence. So I am applying to myself what I am teaching to my students, as simple as this. So this is what I said. So the program was put online, then it was brought down maybe a couple of hours after that, and I was accused of anti-Semitism and the rest of it, the typical accusations. And the network published an apology to the listeners that my views were not accepted and this. So this is one incident, and again it was somehow repeated in different, maybe different scale and different size. I'm not talking about myself as well. Somebody, no, it's only as an example of the different voices, or the voices that it tried to offer some sense, some rational analysis, to put things into perspective, of course, into context. The context thing was the most fought against by the mainstream media over the past maybe 3, 4, or 6 weeks of the event. Don't talk about the context. We need to talk about October the 7th. And again, as I mentioned at the very beginning, it was as if a taboo to talk about the context, to say, well, listen, even if we limit things to Gaza Strip, not to talk about Palestine, not to talk about, the colonization of Palestine that goes back to 1948. Let's talk about Gaza. Gaza Strip has been under siege since 2007. And now over the past 17, 18 years, we had multiple wars on Gaza. And people were suffocated in this very narrow strip of land. You have 2.3 million Palestinians under every single pressure that you can think of. You have silent death on a daily basis in hospitals. Babies are dying because there weren't enough medical treatment. People with, let's say, cancer, they can't leave the strip to have adequate treatment. Just imagine yourself having cancer in the Gaza Strip, or breast cancer in the Gaza Strip. And I know I was close enough to some organization with the breast cancer women in Gaza Strip before October the 7th. 1/3 of the patients, they couldn't leave the Gaza to the West Bank to have treatment, meaning you will die there. So as long as you, as Palestinians, as a Palestinian, you are exercising silent death and the quiet death, that's fine with us. Nobody listens, nobody hears about this. October the 7th is the explosion of all these multiple pressures on the Palestinians. Now, when you die loudly, the whole world would take notice. It is very unfortunate reality. So we go back, and now the Palestinians that were killed during now by Israeli brutality and war, direct killing, the wars. We have 4 or 5 wars on Gaza Strip since 2007 until now. So we have thousands and thousands of Palestinians killed. Where are they? Who cared about them? Nothing. You need to remove them from the picture. You need to remove all these backstories from the context and talk about October the 7th.
Yes. That's a great answer. I mean, it just guides me to the next question that I want to drill into more, like why there's an obfuscation about the root cause of the problem. So I heard you saying or making the analogy of the situation, you know, with the Titanic movie, for example. So how big of an obstacle has it been, the labeling of the Palestinian resistance movements, the armed resistance in particular, as terrorists, to block any objective analytical discussion or discourse on the Palestinian struggle for freedom? I mean, is this labeling intentional? I mean, given the wider historical context of other liberation movements against the colonization and imperialism, like how much of an obstacle, how much of a blockage is that labeling to objectively talk about Gaza and what's happening in Gaza and the right to resist against this settler colonial regime that extends, as you mentioned, not even from 1948, even before that, since, you know, Balfour Declaration, so on and so forth. So it's just that, you know, massive obstacle for people to objectively talk about the right to resist, but then we have that labeling. So I just would like to pick your thoughts on this bit.
Yeah, of course. I mean, this is one of the core issues, terrorism and labeling resistance as terrorism. But before delving into this, let me, Ahmed, make a quick note on the Titanic analogy, because you mentioned it. I use this even in my classroom teaching, saying if we think of October the 7th and then this massive mainstream Western focus on and fixation on what happened on October the 7th, and then removing what happened before and even what happened after. So just think of the genocide that took place after October the 7th. As we speak now, we are approaching the 38,000 people killed in the Gaza Strip. I was reading somewhere the fire and the bombing used against the civilians in the Gaza Strip is 4 times more the firepower used in Hiroshima. And the Gaza Strip size is maybe 1/3 of Hiroshima area. So can you imagine it? 4 times the atomic bomb that was dropped in Hiroshima now, as we speak, were dropped on Gaza. And then you need to remove this. We need to remove what happened after and what happened before and focus on that event. The analogy of the Titanic comes from, you know, maybe most of us watched the Titanic, and we remember, I asked my students, name me a couple of names of that movie, Titanic. Of course, they remember Jack and Rose, the main 2 stars. Then I said, we were attached to our seats for more than 3 hours, waiting for the fate of Jack and Rose. So you have this big ship fighting, you know, the angry waters and the drowning at the end of the day, with thousands of people dying and drowning, and we can see them in the background. They are nameless, faceless. We didn't care about them. We cared about the fate of Jack and Rose. So the whole issue, the whole emotional attachment was towards Jack and Rose, the 2 stars of the movie. These are the hostages nowadays, the Israeli hostages. Everybody talks about them. And nobody talks about the Palestinians. Tens of thousands of Palestinians killed before, tens of thousands of Palestinians killed after. So maybe in let's say artistic works, in fictions, and in art, even in movie, you can do this, because of course you need to personalize the tragedy and the trauma, and then have the backstory, the entire backstory as a history or something in the wider context. But this is maybe for in art is acceptable, in fiction is acceptable, in a drama could be okayed, but not in real life. In real life, I need to know if you consider me and you as equal human beings, that my blood is as worthy as yours. When we are dealing now with the Palestinian case, it is, the same classical treatment and dealing with colonialism back in the 19th century. That is, you have two classes, two races, superior race that we have to care about. They are worthy, and they have they have all the time the supreme position. And then you have the lower races. We don't care about them. When Churchill was asked in the parliament in 1930s about the people of Palestine, somebody asked him, saying, well, but if we support a Zionist state in Palestine, you have indigenous people there, the Palestinians. He said, well, these are lower grade race. The Jews, the European Jews, they belong to us. They are higher grade race, superior race. So if a superior race goes to a land where a lower race lives, even if this lower grade race lives in the land for millennia, the superior race has the right to take the land and to take everything. This was said on the record. Now, I am saying this because I think this is one helpful perspective to understand the whole idea of designating the Palestinians or others as simply terrorists. Gandhi and the Indian Congress movement was designated as terrorists. Gandhi, the most peaceful maybe person. In 1880s in India, the British killed in the very infamous incident called the mutiny. They killed in a span of a few weeks more than 800,000 Indians because they were terrorists against the British. In Kenya, the Mau Mau revolution for liberation, they were again labeled as terrorists. As you said in you and May in the introduction, Nelson Mandela was designated as a terrorist, he and his African National Congress movement. So this is a typical designation thrown on any anti-colonial, anti-Western, anti-whatever movement if this movement belongs to the lower grade race. And if you think of terror, the whole idea of terrorism at one point, what is terrorism? Why you are so concerned about this? The creation of the industry of terrorism. Now you have journals, violence and terrorism. You have think tanks, policy-orientated centers about terrorism. So you think terrorism is overtaking the whole globe, and on annual rates we have millions of people killed of terrorism. I got interested in this because I think one of the approaches that we need to adopt all the time is to deconstruct and to question every single term, approach that comes from the neo-colonial structure. What is terrorism? And why are you so much obsessed with this? Why this creation, the industry of terrorism? I found the following. I found that terrorism doesn't figure in the most 20 top causes of death globally. So I thought terrorism is like, massive wars, global war, killing people. You can see it. You will see maybe heart disease, you will smoking, you see traffic accidents, you see environmental destruction, poverty. 20 causes, the main causes behind death in the whole world. Terrorism is not there, maybe not in even 50. So why suddenly you push this thing to the top and it becomes the obsession in the media and politics and everywhere? So this is, I think we need to have the colonial and racism perspectives accompanying us throughout understanding this kind of designation. Now, when we come to the Palestinians, that is, sorry for maybe digressing, but when we come to the Palestinian case, again, since 1920s, when the early Palestinians resisted the British, they were labeled terrorists. Ezzedine al-Bassam in early 1930s, who fought and led a rebellion, military rebellion against the British and the Zionists, he was designated as terrorist. He is in his land, in Palestine, fighting colonizers, for God's sake, and then he was labeled as terrorists. Then since then until now, every single Palestinian who would dare to resist and to say no, and of course to resort to armed struggle, which is a legitimate and justified means to resist colonization, occupation, and imperialism, they are designated as terrorists. The PLO and Yasser Arafat, terrorists. And by the way, as a footnote, the PLO, this is now the organization led by Yasser Arafat and by Fatah movement that eventually in late 1980s, early 1990s said armed struggle is not beneficial, not leading us to liberation. Let's try peace talks. And they started peace talks with Israel. Since, again, Oslo Agreement, and even before, that's Oslo Agreement in 1993, until now, 31 years. So this is your partner in peace, quote unquote, the PLO. The PLO, until now, is designated as a terrorist organization by the Congress. So how come? If the PLO, your partner in the so-called peace talks, is still recognized as terrorist,
yes,
what about the other organization like Hamas and others?
It's definitely an imperialist and colonizer's tool to kind of challenge every anti-colonial violence that is there to liberate the indigenous people from colonization. I mean, it's becoming more and more clear. It's a tool that the imperialists use against anybody who stands up and speaks the truth in their face. I want to shift the conversation back, and I want to talk about the current players in the Palestinian resistance front.
Well, before going that, Ahmed, I remember something. I think maybe it's good to share it with you and the audience. The killing of civilians, because this is let's say this is the core of terrorism. So killing civilians, if you think of it, I remember in 2003 the American invasion of Iraq. A journalist asked Madeleine Albright, who was the secretary of state back then. He said, and the figure was confirmed, he said there were 500,000 Iraqi civilians killed in the war and because of the war. So do you think what you have achieved politically and militarily somehow justifies the killing of 500,000? Think again, 500,000 Iraqi civilians. So Albright said, yes, it was worthy of that.
Yeah, that's
so we killed 500,000. Think of that, 500,000 Iraqi civilians. Nobody cared about them. The same figure in Afghanistan. So basically, what Israel is doing, saying, well, killing 38,000 Palestinians in Gaza Strip is the practice that you have done back in the past, and even in the present in Iraq, Afghanistan, here and there. It's normal for us to kill civilians, but it's not acceptable for you to kill our civilians. Though the ratio, and I need to emphasize this, Ahmed, the ratio, I did some research on this, during the Israeli wars in Gaza Strip, the ratio of killed Palestinians to killed Israeli civilians is on average, without going into details, is a 21-1. So for every Israeli civilian over the past 20 years, we have 21 Palestinian civilians killed. And the whole talk is about Hamas. Nobody talks about Israel. Nobody talks about the Palestinian civilians killed on a daily basis. We care about the one Israeli civilian, not the 21 Palestinian civilians. Now, after the genocide, this ratio goes up to 1 Israeli for 47 Palestinians. So for every single Israeli killed, we have 47, and I am talking civilian here, 47 Palestinian civilians. And then the media is obsessed with the Israeli side, Jack and Rose theory.
Yes.
That is, we are superior. We shouldn't be killed. About you, this is another story. You are unworthy, so you could be killed, exterminated, expelled from you. And this is another story.
Yes, I mean, the definition of civilian, according to the international community, I mean, apparently it's different depending on the skin color of that civilian, unfortunately. I really want to get as much as possible out of you, Professor Khaled. So just talking about those current players at the Palestinian Resistance Front, in particular in Gaza at the moment, you know, the role of the Islamic movements in the struggle for liberation. I mean, you've edited a book titled Political Islam, Context versus Ideology a few years back. As an Islamic movement, I mean, how has Hamas evolved throughout the past 4 decades since its inception? I mean, what is the ideology, and has that ideology evolved or changed? I mean, the first Hamas charter is being criticized of being largely anti-Semitic, but then we started to see, I mean, whoever is observing started to see significant shifts in Hamas's understanding of the Palestinian struggle and its ideology. I mean, this was clear at the start of 2000s when Hamas started contemplating being part of the political landscape of Palestine, culminating into, you know, updating its charter in 2017, where it actually recognized Israel and a Palestinian state on the 1967 borders. I mean, acknowledging clearly that their struggle is not against the Jews, but against the Zionist colonial ideology and the Zionist settler colonial project. So in saying all that, like, do we still look at Hamas purely as Islamic movement, or does it have a more of a nationalistic focus to it, actually, not just an Islamic nature?
Yeah, well, Hamas is the transformation, let's say, of a mother organization called the Palestinian Muslim Brotherhood. The Palestinian Muslim Brotherhood is a chapter of the bigger organization, the Muslim Brotherhood, that was created in Egypt in 1928. So this organization had started to branch out in the region, Palestine, Syria, Jordan, Iraq, here and there. And so the Palestinian branch was created in Jerusalem 2 years, in fact, before the creation of the State of Israel. That is in 1946. And the ideology of this organization, the Muslim Brotherhood in Palestine, as it was in other countries, was somehow centered on the Islamization of the society, the local society, the Palestinian society in the case of the Palestinian branch, or the Egyptian society, the Jordan. And they thought that all the illnesses that are facing that society or that country started from the deviation from the true path of Islam, according to their ideology. So they needed to bring back people to what they thought as the pristine path of Islam and religion. Now, facing colonialism in Palestine, the Muslim Brotherhood in Palestine faced a different set of questions. It is not only about an ordinary setting. Now you have occupation, you have colonialism, you have this and that. The answer was, yes, this is a pressing question, but we can't fight colonialism and occupation with a weak society. We need to strengthen the society. The strengthening of the society should be was perceived as bringing them back to Islam. Islam will make them stronger, again, according to the ideology. And then they went down this, the implementation of this ideology for decades, in fact. Even after the creation of Israel, the Muslim Brotherhood would say, we refrain from any confrontation against the occupation because we are still not ready. We are preparing the generations for to become stronger and then to fight Israel. So this took them 40 years. And during the 40 years of this preparation strategy, you have other ideologies, as I mentioned, took the lead in the Palestinian resistance. And in fact, many Palestinians look at the Muslim Brotherhood as an organization that is not involved in resistance, so they lacked any national credentials or legitimacy. They were on the margins, in fact, of the Palestinian national movement that was led by Fatah and other organizations that practiced resistance. So this is why resistance is all the time key, is the vehicle of political legitimacy. The Islamists in Palestine, they lacked that legitimacy during the long years of non-practicing resistance. Now, in 1987, we had the so-called Intifada, the first Palestinian uprising against the Israeli occupation. Everybody took part in that. And the Islamist group, the Muslim Brotherhood, decided to take part and to change strategy. Now they are shifting gear towards confrontation and resistance. And they changed even their name, and they took the name Hamas. So the Muslim Brotherhood became Hamas. So it's a transformation of an older and longer in life organization. This is why they started very strong. Now, this still their political experience was immature. The discourse was immature, I think. Even the charter that was reflected in the charter, the first charter that was published in 1988 was full of anti-Semitic terminology and descriptions and I think most of it was brought to the thought of Hamas from the so-called the protocols of the Elders of Zion. So this is a European document, somehow find its way in Hamas's literature. So if we dig deeper in Hamas's anti-Semitic at that time in 1988, it has some European roots. This is not to say that Hamas was innocent and pure, but only this comes from outside. But I think they needed some more time to mature. And this took place, in fact, in 91, when they published a new memorandum, somehow leaving the charter behind. And as you said, as they grew and have more political experience, they matured, and you have the religious component somehow giving way to the political and national component. So we started to see more Palestinian face of Hamas at the expense of the religious face and content. This is, again, not to say that they ditched, if you like, the religious component. Still, it's there. So you have these two components, the religious on the one hand, and the political national one on the other hand, somehow functioning together, sometimes in harmony, sometimes in lack of it. Sometimes, the political national component takes the driving seat, as we see nowadays. Sometimes, and in certain aspects, in social activities, maybe networking and others, you have the religious component takes the driving seat. But by and large, generally speaking, over the past, let's say 10 years, the Palestinization of Hamas has been visible. And this what makes Hamas maybe more appealing for many Palestinians who are not religious. So many Palestinians have, as I said, maybe criticism of Hamas's social agenda, religious agenda, but they support Hamas for the cause of resistance. And again, this is why resistance remains key in Hamas or in other Palestinian movements' strategy.
100%. And then, to my understanding, I mean, Hamas seeking to be part of the political landscape as well. It is Hamas's realization that it's seeing the situation being very difficult to depend only on armed struggle without the backing of a political structure, of a political branch. And that's the situation for all liberation movements that happen across the history. There has to be negotiation, political negotiation that works hand in hand. And therefore, I think in their new charter, they're declaring that, you know, we are willing to accept 1967 borders, but we cannot, we still denounce Zionism. We still not going to put down the arms, because that's a learning from the PLO as well. So Professor Khaled, a question that is on the mind of so many in the West. So what is Hamas's goal here? So I'm just paraphrasing. So by the looks of it, you know, and after winning the legislative elections in 2006, you know, Hamas seeks to seize power, or perceived to, you know, seek to seize power in the entirety of the occupied Palestinian territories, to create this Islamist society, and in doing so, marginalizing other Palestinian political blocs or parties who do not align with those beliefs, and, you know, eventually, and consistently with their charter, eventually to destroy Israel. So how accurate do you think that characterization of Hamas' end goal is? I know it's a packed question. You got 30 seconds to answer. No, I'm joking.
Yeah, I think Ahmed, the issue is not Hamas. The issue is the Palestinians and the resistance. As I said, even if Hamas was, let's say, destroyed and then disappeared from the entire picture, the causes, the real causes, the root causes of that were behind the creation of Hamas are still there. The occupation and the colonization of Palestine. And then another movement, maybe in this case, if there is any global movement, any ideology, as I said, most of the ideologies, if not all the ideologies, were deployed and employed and used by the Palestinians to liberate their land. They used Marxism, nationalism, pan-Arab nationalism, Islamism. If there is any fashionable, let's say, ideology that becomes powerful, maybe they will adopt it. So I think part of it's a misleading discussion sometimes, you know, to focus too much on Hamas. We need to focus on the resistance of Hamas, and what is where does this put the Palestinians at large, and maybe Hamas, of course, as a political party. Hamas, at the end of the day, is a political movement, a political party. It does have its pros and cons in the eyes of the many Palestinians. Many Palestinians support Hamas. Other Palestinians criticize Hamas. Many Palestinians support Hamas for the resistance thing, as I said, not necessarily for the entirety of Hamas's program. This is up to the Palestinians. I mean, what Hamas needs to achieve, what are Hamas's goals at the end of the day, even if they want to liberate and control the Middle East, that's up to them. They are entitled to say whatever they like, but it's up to the Palestinians at the end of the day to approve this program or not. as they did, I mean, the Palestinians in 2006 and even before, when they had the chance to elect or to practice democracy. So by the end of the day, you have elections, you have the Palestinian people, 14 million Palestinian people. They decide their fate, and they decide who leads them according to the whatever political manifesto. So if Hamas says, we want to establish an Islamic state in Palestine, and then declare this, and then they have their, let's say, election manifesto based on this, be it. Then you have the Popular Front saying, we want to have a Marxist state in Palestine. The movement or the group or Fatah saying, we want to have this or that state, liberal democratic state. Now, they can say whatever they like. But I think at the end of the day, it is up to the Palestinians to judge and then to decide on their fate, the nature of the political structure, whether it was, let's say, a Palestinian state within 1967 borders, or a one-state solution, democratic state, or whatever kind of outcome. It is not, I can have my own views, you can have your own views, Hamas can have their own views, but what is implemented at the end of the day is what the Palestinians as a whole want. So sometimes from my engagement in these debates, I can say some of them very abstract, in fact. People just proposing and suggesting, what if this and that? Well, you have the main bulk, the decision makers, the Palestinian people are somehow disappearing from the debate. I bring them back and I say, whoever can say whatever they like, but at the end of the day, the decision is in the hands of the Palestinians as a whole.
100%. And that just emphasizes the point that, you know, Hamas is an ideology. It's part of the fabric of the Palestinian people. It doesn't represent 100% of the Palestinian population in the whole of Palestine. And in fact, you know, reading about the history and, you know, observing the leadership of Hamas's speeches, Hamas, you know, ever since the beginning of 2000s at least, has always been about unity with the different factions, you know. And the best examples to me, you know, just discussing about the acceptance, because this is leading to my question. The main evidence to that is one of the main names that Hamas has listed to this hostage prisoners exchange was Marwan al-Barghouti, because Hamas deep inside knows that he's one of the best individuals that is able to unite the existing factions and resolve the question of disunity and fragmentation and so on and so forth. But I want to go back to the acceptance of Hamas, and that would be my last question. I promise the audience, and then we'll go through the many questions that I can see in the Q&A, because this is very common question and quite persisting. So I just want to stay on this topic of Hamas. And there was an interesting poll. I'm not sure if you had a look at that, that came out of a center called the Palestinian Center for Policy and Survey Research that's based in Ramallah. The center has conducted research into the level of Hamas acceptance by the Palestinian people in Gaza and the West Bank. Research came out in early March, and it produced pretty fascinating results. You know, that Hamas's popularity in Gaza and the West Bank has actually increased, you know, amongst Palestinians in those regions from December 2023 to December 2024. So how accurate and how close to the ground do you think this poll is? I mean, it must be, you know, almost near impossible to conduct such a solid or any kind of poll right now in Gaza. But the numbers are not very low either. You know, they can be some sort of indicative. You know, we're talking about 60% moving from 50% for Hamas into 60% in March. And there has been also a similar increase in Fatah's support, although lower, probably 22 to 23 to 32% of an increase in support of Fatah in Gaza, moving from December 2023 to March 2024. So the question is, I guess, how do Palestinians feel about Hamas and other political parties in Gaza and the West Bank? Is there still support given, you know, the eventual and the ever-escalating genocide over the past 9 months? I mean, people are very tired, you know, at the moment. How could they still support the main, you know, seemingly the main reason of their current suffering? Like, it's mind-boggling that there's still support. Like, what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, let me start with a comment on the center that conducted the survey, the Palestinian Center for Policy Survey and Research. This is a respected policy research think tank in Ramallah, headed by a respected academic, Dr. Khaled Hroub. So, and they used to have these polls, I think, every 2 or 3 months, maybe every 3 months before October the 7th. So this is periodical exercise, and many academics and researchers, they rely on these figures in their research. So the credibility of the center is acknowledged. However, it's really very difficult for me to judge specifically on this poll, because again, the question that you have alluded to, which is how could you conduct a solid, credible poll in Gaza Strip nowadays? Now, I know the center, they do this via phone or WhatsApp and this and that in random sample. They have their own means to be scientific and to minimize the margin of error and all of that. But still, maybe the question is still, I guess it has its own merits. Now, my own take on the results, I was surprised by myself, especially about the figures coming from Gaza Strip. I know for sure, and I go with the figures about the West Bank, that is the support for Hamas has gone up high because of their resistance and the steadfastness and all of that. But you are outside the picture. You are not suffering. You are not tired. You are not, you know, under the daily, maybe hourly bombardment by the Israeli army. Whereas in Gaza, my prediction and via my contacts and the people that I know here and there, yes, you have a decrease, in fact, in Hamas's support and popularity, which is understandable. And here I differentiate between supporting Hamas and the decrease in Hamas's support and the position vis-a-vis resistance. So people would say, no, I am with resistance, but you know, Hamas's decision was that immature or wrong or this and that. So the notion of resistance, as if it's still sacred. So people, they just put it on a side, and then they say, we talk about and we criticize Hamas. So you have voices criticizing Hamas in Gaza Strip more than any other maybe Palestinian locality. When we talk about the Palestinians in the diaspora, many indications point to the fact that Hamas's support has even multiplied across again Hamas, the Palestinian communities globally. Now, in Gaza, there is another kind of let me say argument among, I would say maybe this is the main, if not the main, if it's not the main argument, one of the main arguments nowadays in the Gaza Strip, saying the following: maybe Hamas took the wrong decision in October the 7th, the scale of it, or the unpredicted maybe consequences. But let's kind of delay that. Let's postpone that until the war is finished. It is not a national practice. It is not a good practice. It is not a patriotic practice to open this chapter and to start criticizing Hamas and attacking Hamas during the war of resistance, because Hamas is doing the entire job of resistance. So let's delay that. Let's postpone that. So I think there is this argument which is more responsible for many Palestinians, even if they are critical of Hamas, saying it is not the time. It is not the proper time. Look at what is happening on the Israeli side. You had deep divisions before October the 7th, and then once the war came in, they closed ranks, and then they created a national coalition or a war cabinet even between all the rival groups and parties, and then they act as one. So let's just delay that and focus on how to deal with the situation in terms of resistance and maybe supporting the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. So in general and in brief, I think the picture is still, I would say, gray. We can't say black and white. So all these figures, they could give us some indication, but we have to take them with a great measure of caution, I guess.
Yes, that was actually one of the questions that came to mind when you started speaking, like how could Hamas take this unilateral decision of doing these actions without consultation of, the representatives of the people, embarking on such a reckless, action that, resulted in what we're doing now. But I think I agree with you that these questions must be answered and addressed. But I think the current situation doesn't allow for it to be entertained properly or addressed properly. Apologies to everyone hijacking Professor Khaled for my questions. There's a lot of questions in there. I hope we can get through most of them. So the first question is about whether you, Professor, have a crystal ball around you, ready to give us some expectations about the future of the Israeli entity in the coming decade or so.
Say that again. I didn't follow you.
So what is your expectation about the future of Israel in the coming decade or so?
Again, I am not in the business of a prediction. We academics, we stay with the reality on the ground and trying to understand what's happening. But I guess one of the consequences of October the 7th is to put some really serious, big question marks on the entirety of the Zionist project. This is a project that was created against the indigenous Palestinians on their land, stealing their properties and everything. And now it has been exposed. People started to talk about the origin of the cause, not again, despite all the effort that we can see here and there. People started to start, what is happening? Why, what is this thing called Palestine on the Palestinian cause? So I think this questioning is bringing back to the table the origin of the project, and which is very great and healthy. And I think the talk about the dismantling the racist colonial Israeli project is now gaining more and more currency, even among non-Zionist Jews. That is, as long as you have a racist colonial project in any part of the world, then you will have wars, conflicts, and now genocide and all sorts of wars. So you need to go to the basics and the root cause of the whole problem, which is the dismantling of this racial colonial project. And then after that, we talk.
Yes, thank you very much for answering this question. I've got an interesting question here. You mentioned about the liberation movements, the historical liberation movement, the Marxism and socialism and so on and so forth. So the question says, it's interesting thinking of different ideologies as tools that Palestinians tried to use for liberation. Why do you think Marxism and socialism failed to achieve this? Is socialism still useful as a tool for Palestinian liberation?
I think, yes. First of all, I mean, the failure of Marxism and socialism is something not to do with Palestine or the region. Of course, it has been a global and universal struggle. And then we all know the imperial Western colonial attack on socialism and Marxism was beyond imagination. So you have massive attack against this ideology that was led by the notion of global justice. Now, we agree or disagree with so many practices here and there with the Stalin and with the implementation of extreme, let's say, versions and maybe violation maybe of the core ideas. Yes, but you have an ideology that called for social justice. And when you call about social justice, this means the flattening of all these hierarchies and the structures where you have the metropoles controlling the rest of the world. So you have a human essence in the project. So I think maybe it's a bit too much to say it has failed. It has been weakened. It has been defeated, yes. But in Latin America, still in Palestine, we have the Popular Front, we have the Democratic Front, we have leftist, Marxist leaning groups. So it is not. I wouldn't say it's a total disappearance from the project, and the history doesn't end against what Fukuyama predicted. Yes, it goes up and down. This is maybe we are in the days of the neo-colonial imperial structure, but again, the struggle is still continuing and going on. So let's be optimistic on this sense.
On that optimistic note, there is a really interesting question about the US involvement into what's happening in Palestine. So the question goes, what is the strategic value for the US to support Israel? Is it about oil? Is it about the gas that was recently discovered on Gaza shores? What is it about that, the US blind support of Israel?
Yeah, I think maybe we need to revisit the idea of Israel as an asset for the US in the Middle East. It has become a burden in terms of interest calculations, pure naked interest calculations. What is the use of Israel to America? The oil is running smooth and well. America controls, the Gulf with or without Israel. So what is it then? I think part of the answer, and I am not claiming to offer a well-rounded answer, part of the answer is to do with the ideology. There is an ideology, American ideology, behind Zionism. And this goes back in history. Part of it, of course, Christian Zionism support. And when we say Christian Zionism, you have this idea that even predated Zionism with at least half a century, saying bringing back the Jews, the world Jews to Palestine is a prerequisite for the reappearance of the Messiah, the Christian Messiah. So you have many Christian groups who are not necessarily pro-Jews or love Jews. Many of them were, in fact, anti-Semites, but they believed in the idea of bringing back the Jews globally to Palestine because this will speed up the appearance of the Messiah and then bringing back the kingdom of God and peace and whatever to the whole world. So you have this religious ideological component behind the support of Israel blindly. as we can see it, I think the head of the American senators, I think he said, well, that is my job. My job as my duty as a religious man, as a religion, is to support Israel. So it comes from religion. Another component, then I end by this, another component, which is again a mix of political, historical, and common psyche, is the thought of Israel as a prototype of the American project. So the American project is what? Is, all these Puritans or white Europeans crossing the Atlantic and then building the new world against the indigenous people, then creating this massive, great civilization. Look at this, the leader of the whole world, the light on the mountain. So, and it's a grand narrative. So over 2 centuries now, you have America leading the whole world. The basic of it is poor immigrants. They came from Europe. They were persecuted in Europe. And yet now you have the same story with Israel. This is how it's framed. These poor Jews coming from Europe, persecuted, and then they go to this so-called desert in Palestine. They made it bloom. And then they created this fantastic, great country, scientific and democratic. So you have this kind of similarity. Now, one footnote is the indigenous people of the America. Millions of them, dozens of millions in America, they were exterminated during this grand story, grand journey. Well, we are sorry for this, but you are not the story. The indigenous people, you are a footnote. Now we have museums to say sorry for you. We build some museums. We write about you in the books, and we say, well, maybe we made some mistakes. Again, the same story with Israel. The main story, the main narrative is framed in that line, the line of the Jews coming to Palestine. Now you have, well, unfortunately, we had some people there called the Palestinians. Footnote again, well, we have to kill them. We are very sorry for this. Maybe in the future, once we are victorious, we will build some museums for you guys. But it's the same. So you have this element of similarity, I think, of seeing Israel, looking in the mirror and seeing Israel as us, the Americans. So I think these two components could help us in explain, again, not fully answer the question. Thank you.
Yes. A question that is similar to, the US support, talking about the Western society's support, governments namely. So I get a question that says, the Australian government has said it would recognize Palestine as part of a peace process towards a two-state solution. Can you comment on the state of the peace process and prospect of bringing an end to the conflict?
Yeah. Well, first of all, let's talk about, the terminology again. I encourage myself, encourage you, Ahmed, and all the audience all the time to spend some time on every single term that has been used and exploited and even overused and became like a scripture, a sacred, text. What is the peace process? When you say peace process, it has the origin of the term was designed by somebody called Henry Kissinger, who was security national advisor to Nixon in late 1970s. And he said, we need, when you create a process, when you want to make peace, and achieving peace is very hard because you have so many difficulties in the way. It creates a process. This means the process takes time, and you create this perception that something is happening and peace is achievable, and we are heading towards achieving peace. So you create a peace process. Now, when it comes to the Palestinians, this has been, in fact, in Madrid conference in 1991. Since 1991, we are living in this process. There is no peace, but process. Now, what's the beneficial of the process? The process gives you this cover, the diplomatic cover, under which you can achieve so many things. Israel achieved normalization with so many African countries, Asian countries, with China, with India, because we are doing peace with the Palestinians. We are no longer occupier. We are no longer a colonizer. We are doing peace. Just give us some time, but the process is going ahead. And even we ended up with normalization with some Arab countries, Arab regimes, I should say, because the process is there. So in fact, number one, there is no process. There is no process. Since I think at least 10 years or maybe even more, 12 years, there is no peace talks, even if they are lip service, if they are just kind of a show. This show never existed. It is not there. So you have a status quo, and the status quo is changing. The status quo is the expansion of settlements in the West Bank. Now we have almost 1 million Zionist settlers in the West Bank. The West Bank being, supposedly the Palestinian state. The West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Gaza Strip. So in this peace, where the Oslo Accord said, potentially, hopefully, you will have in the future a Palestinian state. This land is now infiltrated by more than 1 million Israeli hardline fanatics, even in the West Bank. So there is no such a thing called peace process. The second terminology that I disagree with is the so-called two-state solution. What is it? The two-state solution. Think of it. Two states means we need to end up with a solution where you have two states. But now we have one state. You have Israel. So one of these two states is already established. Not only established, one of the most powerful states in the Middle East, maybe in the whole world. So it's again misleading. That maybe the better, I wouldn't say that the best terminology is to say we need a Palestinian state in 1967 borders, because one state is already there since 1948. So to emphasize that state and to say, well, the two-state solution is somehow, it needs to be deconstructed, in fact. So again, this is another. Now, even if whether you call it two-state solution or a Palestinian state in 1967 borders, the reality on the ground run against the logic because of the settlements, because of the expansion, and because of the rise of the right-wing ideology in Israel. Now, there is no constituency that supports the idea of a Palestinian state, even if it was disarmed, even if it was weak, even if it was in whatever form. There is no supporters for this idea, no longer. So again, another maybe way or cause for us to think again of these ideas.
Thank you very much for pointing that out, because it's on the minds of many people ever since the genocide started. I mean, there's a need to kind of decolonize our language from those outdated terminologies, if you will, talking about peace, talking about two states, talking about, sovereignty. There's no such a thing under occupation, of course. You're talking about a bubble, whereas there's a government inside, but then when you go through the checkpoint outside into another bubble, you realize the system of Bantustans that you live in. So there's a number of things that we want to get rid of, remnants from, the colonial powers and the imperialists rather, imposed on us as supporters of Palestine and as Palestinians. I wanna ask this kind of seemingly provocative question, but it's pretty persistent, and many people are asking. So can you comment on the claims that Israel has actually funded Hamas at some point? At a certain time throughout the history of Hamas, Israel did provide some support in terms of their social activities in Gaza. I mean, even under the siege, you know, Netanyahu was bragging that, you know, we need to maintain Hamas to be a governance in Gaza and so on. So in some way, Israel has kind of seemingly funded Hamas and maintained it. So I'd like to hear your comments on that bit.
Yeah, number one, this talk about, you know, even goes back to 1970s, 1980s, saying Israel, in fact, created Hamas. I dig deep into this claim and tried to do my own homework and research. What happened is that Israel issued a license for the Islamic University in Gaza and for something like Islamic Center charity in Gaza in late 1970s. And these were, you know, the main hubs for the Muslim Brotherhood in Gaza Strip and in Palestine. So again, the mother organization of Hamas. 10 years down the line, we will have something called Hamas. Now, these licenses were, yes, true. Israel gave the same licenses in the West Bank for other Palestinian universities, secular universities, leftist ones, because it's the occupier force, the occupier authority. So if you want to have a charity, to build a charity, if you want to build a university, any institution, that is the authority that would legalize the functioning of any of these institutions. So what happened in the Gaza Strip happened in the West Bank as well, equally happened in the West Bank. So it was a policy at the end of the day to facilitate the people under occupation according to international law. So it wasn't a big deal. So that couldn't be accounted as the creation of Hamas was made by Israel or this and that. Now, when Hamas became strong in 1990s, this story came to the surface again. And my humble analysis goes along this line. That is, it's more acceptable for Israel and for the ego of the Israeli intelligence to say, well, we were behind Hamas's creation, but you know what, we made some mistakes. It went out of control. It's more acceptable to take this rather to say, well, Hamas was created against our will, and we were there, and we couldn't do anything about it. So in this case, it's a sign of paralysis. We couldn't do anything. We are not the upper hand, but that we created you, and then you made some mistakes or you deviated from. We are still at the upper hand. Now we can see the same story nowadays. Some media stories came about saying even October the 7th was some intelligence, they knew about it in advance.
That was my next question, 100%, yes.
Yeah. They knew about it in advance, but you know, they just allowed it for different reasons. Again, this is to say to keep the upper hand in intelligence and control. It is too much hurting for a colonial ego to say, well, while I am colonizing and controlling the area, something big happened and took place against my will. I would reverse the story. I would kind of rechannel the story in a way saying, well, I knew about it. Then I thought I would channel it. I would redirect the whole thing to serve my interest. However, my plan failed. So that is too much. I think there is some acrobats here. Intelligence, psychology, ego. I think in the interplay that we need to account for.
100%. I think, to my understanding, I think there's some level of condescension as well. Like, you know, you can't do anything until I allow you to do it. So it's like a colonizer understanding of perception. I am aware that we're taking too long. This is the last couple of questions. I'm aware also that your glass of water has run out. So, and your mouth is pretty dry. So the last couple of questions, Professor Khaled. So someone is asking, there appears to be armed resistance groups in the West Bank emerging at the moment over the past few years. you know, Den of Lions, you know, Katibat Jenin, and so on and so forth. What do you know of them? And there seem to be a lot of different brigades as well developing there, also part of Hamas, possibly. I mean, where do you see them fit within the bigger picture of the Palestinian resistance? Is it something that's leaking out from Gaza? What's that new nature developing in the West Bank?
Yeah, I don't know that much, in fact, to be honest and frank. But what I can say is that they are not leaking from Gaza. No, these are the Palestinians. So you have Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. You have 3 million Palestinians and maybe a half in the West Bank, and they resist on a daily basis. They are under multiplicity of pressures in terms of security and intelligence, not only from the Israelis, but also, unfortunately, from the Palestinian security forces that are in cooperation with the Israelis, because the West Bank is the main hub, is the main concern for Israel and the settler movement. For them, this is part of the Holy Land. This is, in fact, the Holy Land, the ancient Holy Land, the biblical land. So the pressure and the focus on the West Bank is enormous. And the killing, of course, is on a daily basis. And despite that, we have these groups in Tulkarem, Jenin, Nablus, here and there, which is amazing. For me, it's an amazing phenomenon. Again, emphasizing the significance and the significance of resistance, and as a crucial strategy for the Palestinians. Because many Palestinians nowadays in the West Bank, in Gaza Strip, in Jerusalem, in the diaspora, they thought we gave up basically 78% of the historic land of Palestine in Oslo. According to Oslo Accords in 1993, the PLO recognized Israel on 78% of the historic land of Palestine. And this is why many Palestinians opposed these accords. Hamas opposed them. Still, though, the official representative of the Palestinians agreed on that deal. So nobody could think of a concession more than that. And despite that massive historic concession made in Oslo, 1993, nothing happened on the ground. In fact, exactly the opposite. More expansion, more settlements, more subjugation of the Palestinians. So this is why people said enough is enough. Even when we decide to give the so-called peace talks the chance and opportunity, and this is the end result. The end result is losing more and more land, sovereignty, dignity, and all of that. So resistance again became the default option. The resistance groups, many of them in the West Bank, belong to Fatah movement, which is supposedly the backbone of the PLO, and whose president is Mahmoud Abbas. Yet you have some descending factions and angry elements and angry groups against Mahmoud Abbas himself, against the Palestinian Authority, saying enough is enough. You are doing just the dirty job of the occupation. So it's kind of not only Hamas, it is, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, Fatah, Popular Front, across the board, which is again remarkable for me, despite all the odds to happen in the West Bank.
And just a clarification, by resistance in the West Bank, you actually mean, armed resistance to pressure occupation into, dismantling the system of occupation.
Yeah, armed and even popular resistance as well, because it goes across. But our talk here may be on about the armed resistance specifically.
Yes, I mean, talking about different sorts of types of resistance, my last question would be, how can the international community effectively support Palestinian resistance and the quest for justice? I mean, what role do we believe nonviolent resistance plays in the Palestinian struggle? And, how effective has it been historically and presently? People might be discouraged about, for example, boycotting BDS, doesn't work. And I heard you saying the other day making that ants kingdom analogy, you know, comparing it to how every single effort helps. Like, can you give us some tools that we can use in the West, for example, around nonviolent resistance to help the Palestinian struggle?
Yeah, much could be said here. In fact, this is a whole lecture. But in brief, I think we have long agenda that need to be working on. Number one, at the very high political level, meaning translating what we see in the streets of supporting Palestine and opposing the genocide, seeing it translating into political action and political decision maker. Now, in the West and from Europe and America, we have this gap between the popular mood that we see in the protests and demonstrations and the decision makers and parliaments. We need to bridge this gap. What is happening in the street should be translated in the elections, in local elections, national elections, and then to the parliaments and so on and so forth. Unfortunately, until now, in many countries, look at Europe, you have now right-wing parties winning national elections, where you have in the street more support to Palestine. So there is some sort of contradiction. Are there less people going vote in these elections? I mean, people who support Palestine, they support Palestine in the street, but they don't vote. What is exactly happening? So we need to figure out this, and this is very crucial. That is, we need to go and vote and elect the MPs and the member of parliament who would support Palestine, to translate again, to move Palestine as a local issue, not only a foreign issue discussed in governments, but also in parliaments. So this is number one. Number two, at the individual level, and maybe the thing that you mentioned is every little thing helps. Don't minimize. Don't say, well, my effort or I wouldn't. What kind of addition? What kind of added value on me personally if I go in the street? Because you have 1 million protesters anyway. So it wouldn't make any difference if 1 million and one person. In fact, no, these 1 million, if every one of them think the same way, then the street will be empty. But if we have another million saying, well, me being present in the street would count, then we will have a 2nd million. So the individual responsibility is very crucial. Even if you don't buy Coca-Cola or Pepsi or boycott any product, don't have this dialogue between you and yourself in the supermarket. Okay, it wouldn't mind, because I mean, it's just one time. Because if everyone says the same, then the boycott campaign would fail. But in that monologue between you and yourself in the supermarket, no, I'm not gonna touch it. If this monologue applies to 1 million people, then we have 1 million people not buying that product. So this individual sense of responsibility is so crucial. And the analogy that I gave you on the other day, the ants, kingdom, it's very impressive. I really encourage every one of us to go on YouTube and just Google, ants kingdoms, because I show it to my students as well. So you have this maybe 2 by 2 kilometers square underground, built by ants. This is the weakest species that you can think of. They build colonies 2 kilometers by 3 half kilometer depth. It's massive. And then the hierarchy, the structure, the distribution of labor, it's so impressive. You just think of it. And then when this little ant is holding a small grain or anything, then running with it maybe half a kilometer, what are you doing? What kind of impact, what kind of contribution you think you are doing by this little tiny thing in 5 kilometer square kingdom? But the persistence is amazing. The persistence of this ant to take this little grain and to do it, to take it, put it in the right place, that made the kingdom. And this is why my advice to myself and to everybody, that is, don't think that your little thing is unnoticed, or no. It's part of the victory. It's part of the bringing a global justice, not only for Palestine, for our entire world. We are not working for Palestine. We need a global justice. We need a global justice, and Palestine is only one issue of this justness that we seek.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for that elaboration. And, that story of Ants Kingdom Underground is kind of pertinent because, we're talking about the Hamas and the tunnels and so on and so forth. So it's quite, in a way. Professor Khaled, I want to thank you, but I want to invite you to provide us with last remarks. I mean, over the past couple of hours of a conversation, time flew, and, there's a genocide that is happening at the moment. Probably in the last 2 hours, many people have been massacred already in this genocide. So, I mean, I can't help but asking you, are you optimistic about the future? I mean, is there still prospect of a peaceful resolution in Palestine? I mean, and that would be your final remark. Let's please give us some hope, and let's end on an optimistic note.
Yes, definitely. Definitely, I am optimistic. I mean, without optimism, we would have died. We would have be killed maybe by depression. But I think no. The whole world. If you look at the streets, if you look at the energy, at the university encampments, and look at some stories coming even from the Gaza Strip. People are singing, on the destruction of their homes and the streets, and they still sing, and they send us, people are smiling and saying, we will fight. This is the spirit that we need to have. If let's say, pessimism dominated, the Indians in 19th century and early 20th century, maybe Britain would have been controlling India until this very moment. At the darkest moment of oppression, colonization, and occupation, one could see maybe no hope. This happened with the Algerians under the French colonization that lasted for 130 years in Algeria. Can you think of the Algerians, let's say, in the random year 1870, 40 years after the occupation and colonization of Algeria? 40 years, everything is controlled by Algeria, by France. Nothing, even the language. No hope whatsoever. But still, you had, the determination and the will of the people. The ants of the Algerians started building that kingdom of liberation and emancipation, block by block, until the end result. Mao Zedong, the famous Chinese leader, he said, the road of 100 miles starts with one step. So if you think of it, it's a cliche. It's very cliche, but it needs contemplation. Think of it. The 1,000 mile road or destination starts with one step. Think of yourself at the mile number 16. Oh my God, still you have more than 900 miles to go. But you don't know the destination. You don't know the victory. You have no even perception or framing of it. But unless you do the mile number 16, the mile number 17 will never be done or achieved. So your responsibility is to do your mile, and then to have this building blocks one after another. So I am optimistic.
On that optimistic note, I really want to thank you very much, Professor Khaled. It's been incredibly educational, informative, and enlightening. And I do want to apologize for those questions who have not been posed to you. We will make sure to record them, and if that's okay with you, Professor Khaled, we can send it to you via email, and then we can get answers and send them back to the respective individuals who made them. Again, I want to thank you very much for being with me for 2 hours. I want to thank all the audience as well. And I now want to hand it to May Safe to close this session. You're on mute, May.
For once, I needed my mute off. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Khaled Hroub and Ahmed. That was an extremely insightful conversation. I think it's really important to recognize that these are type of narratives as Palestinians we rarely get to hear in the Western context. For a very long time, Palestinian voices have been silenced. Our narrative, our stories, our analysis of our own resistance movement has been silenced. And I think you both highlighted that Palestinian resistance is part and parcel of our very existence. We are persistent. We have a will to survive. We have a long history of resistance against occupation and oppression. And I think it's important to acknowledge that the term peace has been used as a Western construct, and it's been weaponized against Palestinians as a cover for Israel to continue doing what it's doing, which is the ethnic cleansing of Palestine and the occupation and dispossession of Palestinians from their hands, homes and lands. But in particular, Israel has built an apartheid regime and structure that is there to monitor and control Palestinians every facet of their existence. And I thank you both for highlighting how Palestinians have resisted this. I think it's also really important to note that we've had a plethora of kind words thanking you for your contributions, this talk. We've had over 600 attendees, and I think we've had countless messages coming through, thanking you across Australia. Just a reminder and a thank you to those who hosted this webinar: Palestine Justice Movement Sydney, Free Palestine Melbourne, Justice for Palestine Yangonjin, Australian Friends of Palestine, Tasmanian Palestine Advocacy Network, and the Palestine Action Group Canberra. Every single one of these organisations have live streamed this talk across the country. They will also have it published on their socials, particularly Free Palestine Melbourne and Palestine Justice Movement Sydney will have them on their YouTube pages and their social pages for those of you who would like to listen back on this or wish to share this with their friends and families. It's very rare to have these type of conversations here in Australia, particularly because the narrative is very much so dominated by Zionist talking points, and it's important for us to bring a Palestinian perspective and experience. For some of you as well, you may have seen that before you joined our webinar today, you received an email. All funds raised from this particular webinar is going to support refugee families who've arrived here in Gaza. In particular, a large family has arrived from Gaza who've had very traumatic experiences, and the funds raised will be donated them to support them while they're here in Australia. If you feel like you'd like to support Palestinian families, in particular this family, we will be sending out an email with a QR code that you can donate further. I'd also like to highlight that Dr. Khaled Hroub has very kindly sent us an excerpt of one of his writings, Hamas and a Century of Resistance. He wrote this on the 2nd of December of 2023, highlighting Palestinian resistance in the current context. And it's quite an, I think, a succinct and great read for those of you who are interested in this topic. We will be emailing this through to everyone. So thank you, Dr. Khaled Hroub, for sending this through to us. For those of you who do have other questions about Palestinian resistance, we will be holding future events in the addressing those. It's extremely important that we start Free Palestine Melbourne as well as Palestine Justice Movement Sydney and all the other groups. We believe in ensuring that we have Palestinian voices heard, and we are about educating the public around Palestinian resistance and our stories and our voices. So thank you every one of you who have joined us here today. It's been an honour to have both of Dr. Khaled Hroub and Ahmed host this session, and we look forward to hearing you speak to us again in the future. Thank you everyone. On behalf of everyone, have a wonderful night. In solidarity, there are thousands, as Dr. Khaled Hroub said, thousands and millions of us who've been in the streets every single week, and we're not stopping. Every single one of us plays a part in resistance and standing in Palestine in solidarity with Palestine. But standing with Palestine also means you stand with every single oppressed person and fighting for a world that actually values human rights and equality and doesn't perpetuate crimes and wars and apartheid and oppression and suppression of Indigenous peoples around the world. So thank you, everyone.
Thanks, May. Thanks, Professor Khaled.
Yeah.
Thanks, everyone.